welcome to Dipping and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate on this lovely Tuesday to be sitting down with Paul Maskall. Paul is Principal Strategic Fraud Prevention and Behavioural Lead at UK Finance, and I'm quite proud I got all that out in one go, Paul.
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it, really?
It is. And as I so often like to do, rather than me trying to explain what you do, it's probably best to hand over to the expert and you tell us a bit more about yourself and what you do, Paul.
Yeah, so it's a bit of an identity crisis, really. So again, I'm a kind of ex-law enforcement. I've worked in UK finance for about 3.5 years now. And again, with this role it's even more so of an identity crisis, is that I sit both within City of London Police from an HQ point of view in relation to economic crime and cyber, but also on UK finance side and their economic crime unit as well. But really, what I kind of boil my work down is I'm much more of a flowery social scientist than it comes down to anything else. So when I look at these sorts of aspects of crime, aspects of control, manipulation, and abuse, very often it's the case of I say, okay, well, what need is being met? How is it that we are much more vulnerable to online coercion and that sort of aspect as well? So I'm doing a part-time PhD in the subject around things like online manipulation as well. So pretty much everything I do and everything I talk about when it comes to presenting, comes to training, has this kind of undertone where I look at, right, everybody's been told something that they wanted to hear at the wrong time. You should have heard it. And very often it's the case where it's, okay, well, what is it that makes us much more vulnerable to this sort of thing? So very often I kind of explore that. And as you can imagine, because I kind of boil it down much more to the behavioral science and the kind of the psychology to it, I find myself kind of almost moving into different subjects, and not just fraud and scams, but economic crime, economic abuse, coercive control, manipulation with a kind of capital M, and all these sorts of things as well. So that's kind of a nutshell of the sort of thing I end up doing. So.
And what a lot that is, and this is what I'm always fascinated about. Everybody I talk to, everybody's just doing so many different things. I mean, a PhD and part-time PhD while you're doing nothing else, it is pretty spectacular, to be fair to you.
I think it's somewhat masochistic. I'm not sure. but,
yeah, you just don't know when to stop.
Yeah, like the people look at me kind of that side eye, going, "Really? Are you doing this all at the same time? Are you?" It's like,
what's the punishment that they say, aren't you? And do you know something that struck me this morning? I was thinking about our recording today, and one of the things that I get asked so often is, and I'm sure many people who work in the area of domestic abuse do as well, is why don't they just leave? It's kind of the most common question, because to the outside world and to society, not as a whole, because it's changing and people are starting to understand things a bit better, still a long way to go, but it's still that question that is putting that blame and shame on the victim, survivor, individual, however somebody wants to identify themselves as, when they've experienced abuse. But, when it comes to the financial aspect of it, and when you start to actually explain to people, well, actually, can you imagine having no control over your finances, loans taken out that you've been coerced into taking out in your own name, so it's already in your name, all these things that really play, and that word vulnerability, we keep hearing it, don't we? But it's so true, because this is what happens when you are coerced, when you are manipulated, all the terms we hear, gaslighted, etc. Then what essentially is your kind of freedom in a way of having the finances to potentially leave the situation, all of a sudden becomes something that isn't an option.
And the thing is that's the thing, is that the language becomes, and I think this is where I've kind of explored it, is because the language becomes very similar in both fields. So not just in domestic violence in relation to why didn't they just leave? Why would they stay with that person? Why would they stay in that sort of environment or context or relationship or financial situation? Insert context here, basically. But the same sort of language is used in the same way in relation to fraud, scams. It's one of the only crime types that you kind of fall for in relation to it. It implies a great deal of shaming and kind of a kind of ownership over, well, actually, there's the victim. No, well, actually, there is a criminal that is directly or indirectly targeting you and coercing you and manipulating you to steal your money or your data.
Yeah.
That's actually what's happened, whether that is over 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 years. And very often it's the case where things like in romance scams, well, of course you haven't met them in person, or how could you possibly fall for that? How could you believe that that would be true, etc. And the thing is that people want to believe that it's true. Like again, it's very often is that over the last nearly 10 years of going down this kind of rabbit hole in relation to the psychology behind it, is that both cognitive dissonance. So again, have you ever been in a relationship that you feel you shouldn't have been in, and that two opposing narratives that are going on in your head? So that narrative that's saying, I'm probably not happy, I probably should get out of this situation, versus what other behaviors, both consciously and subconsciously, are keeping you in this situation.
Yeah.
What need is being met?
Mm.
Now, I've personally as well, for a lot of things that have helped me, is IFS, so internal family systems, which is a systems thinking approach to a therapeutic model, basically. And very often it talks about the parts of you that exhibit different behaviors because of what's happened in childhood, trauma, etc.
Yeah.
It's different ways of talking about it. But the fact is very often in these situations, whether I'm talking to somebody online or whether I'm having a relationship with somebody, there is a need being met.
Mm.
And that need doesn't always necessarily have to be healthy. It doesn't have to be good for you in any way, shape, or form. But very often it's that compulsion to be able to do so.
Yeah.
So whether it is online or offline, or in a relationship with inverted commas that you've met online, is that everybody has been told something they wanted to hear at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And that aspect of that belief system is that we are very good at telling ourselves a story in order to justify that narrative.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh God, I couldn't agree more. And very often I think as human beings, we want to believe, and especially if you're kind of like that empath, and very often victims, survivors, individuals, they are very empathetic. They want to see the best in everybody, and they hope that maybe one day the perpetrator will change. And that's where the trauma bond comes in, doesn't it? Because we
mhm.
go back again and again to where we just want to get back to that point where everything was okay, but everything wasn't okay. You were being, as you said, you're being told what you want to hear, and you just want to get back to what's sad is not reality, but where you were put in that situation where you believe what that person was saying. And that's what always makes me really quite sad, is that feeling that for many, many people, they just want to believe the best in, and everybody, and so in terms of relationships, it can be family members. Again, when I've talked about this before, and people sort of look at you and say, family members as abusers, well, yeah, it happens. We have child to parent abuse, we have parents to child abuse. It happens in all sorts of relationships, and that's where it is very difficult, isn't it, to as human beings, where can we kind of draw that line and distinction? And that's where it gets very, very grey, I think.
And this is the thing: is that very often it's also in not just romance scams and that kind of abusive element and that coercive control, is that very often we're fearful of the contrary. And what I mean by
Mm.
that is that the story in which I tell myself, the behavior that I justify, the creation of the narrative around somebody who is I'm talking online, who I've paid money to, or I've ended up opening a lot of loans or finances, or gotten debt for, all that narrative is sometimes, especially through your internal workings, that narrative is a lot less painful to admit, other than admitting the opposite. So
Yeah.
basically, okay, if this narrative that I'm telling myself is wrong, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean to me in relation to whether, okay, am I worthy of this relationship? Am I worthy of the hope that I've put into this relationship? The kind of the sunk cost element of trying to make that relationship work, the money that I've spent, the emotional real estate in which I've spent in this situation. And you have the situation where, again, is that actually from your parts of you that are literally exhibiting that behavior and keeping you in that situation, at all costs want to try to avoid the
Mm.
narrative
Of
that
asking those questions.
is yeah, you don't want to lift up those stones. Human
No.
beings aren't great
Leave
at
Pandora's
lifting
box
up those
alone.
stones. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're not great at it,
No.
unfortunately.
No. And the thing is, once you ask those questions, once the lid is off Pandora's box, you can't put it back on. And that's the awful thing, is because then for a lot of people, they live, especially in domestic abusive situations, they choose to stay, even knowing what's happening, because in many situations, it's, well, this is all I'm worthy of. This is all I deserve in life. So therefore, and also, who else would want me? Who else, that self-worth, that self-deprecation, all those things that we do to those messages we tell ourselves that put us in those situations. And that's exactly what a perpetrator wants. As you say, again, in romance fraud, they just want to keep you constantly within that power and control. And even if you do start to stray and start to maybe try and find some independence, they'll very quickly pull you back through manipulation, through blackmail, through many forms of abuse. And that's what, it's so hard, isn't it, I think, as a whole, to explain to people that this isn't as simple as, well, somebody ended up in this situation, they fell for it, they did this, they did that. No, that's not the case. It's very, very clever, manipulative, cunning behavior. I do like the word cunning as well, because somebody said that to me years ago when I was talking about perpetrators being charming. And this person said, no, well, yes, to a certain extent they're charming, but they're very cunning.
Yes.
And I think that's one thing that, again, is worth talking about, isn't it? It's that, how I can't imagine how somebody who is being defrauded, scammed, how that perpetrator goes through all these elements and all the things they do to keep doing what they're doing. That to me is just, it's another world.
Well, especially from on both sides, is that the criminal is very, very good. And again, any situation like this, when it comes to coercion or manipulation, is that very often, because of the parts that are seeking validation, seeking connection, seeking don't want to displease the other individual from a people pleaser point of view, that a number of different complex factors that will put you in that situation. And very often it's the case where the criminal's comments will either give you hope of the way out of your self-narrative that you're telling yourself, or will support it. So we'll say, yes, you aren't worth anything. You aren't, again, I'm fortifying that belief that you have yourself, and that's incredibly difficult, which can also imprison it. But also the fact is, especially with things like online romance scams, online manipulation, or anything like that, is that when you've met somebody new, you're engaging with somebody, I may also support it, to explore that and to say, well, actually, you know what? I think you're beautiful. I think you're incredible. I think I want to be with you, and I want to have this relationship with you. And that's incredibly exciting to feel that vindication, but also the hope that you can create of a way out of the way you feel about yourself. And that narrative that you create in that sort of situation. So very often is that when you kind of mentioned earlier in relation to this perspective, it's like, well, like, why do everybody else says, well, oh, you can't, well, why didn't you just leave? Or how could you fall for it? Or how could you be in that situation? Well, you are seeing this example in the cold light of objective day. You are not the complex aspects around trauma and parts and psychology and the cognitive dissonance that goes on for you in those moments. And you are seeing it in the cold light of day, like it was written on a piece of paper. The same with any sort of scams. I can't believe they fell for it. Even if they're the same age as you, the same situation, the same context, is that you can't see it. But the thing is, from a criminal point of view, and especially online, and this is where this kind of justification and rationalization, where I say that human beings are very good at telling themselves a story, is that yes, that's both from a victim point of view and individual point of view, and we're all very good at lying to ourselves in various guises for good and bad reasons, but so are criminals. So the fact is that most of my work in relation to online crime is I need a combination of four things. I need opportunity, I need capability, I need pressure, all to do the things I'm going to do. I commit crime, commit abuse, commit something against somebody. Now, in fraud, capability might be, again, an online internet connection. Just social media or whatever it may be. Opportunity, well, guess what? Unfortunately, there's hundreds of millions of people out there with the right cocktail of vulnerabilities in which I can tell you what you wanted to hear. Now, the pressure, Can be, I don't know, whether it be lifestyle, it can be a number of different factors that will push me to look at the financial rewards of enacting criminality or whichever, or it will just be an element of control. It can be an internal psychological aspect in relation to that. But the thing is, the real key factor, especially in online communication, is that the rationalization. So, what story can I tell myself in order to justify and rationalize the behavior in which I'm exhibiting?
Yeah.
Very often people say, well, how can these people sleep at night? How can they do the things they do? Well, unfortunately, because they tell themselves a story that justifies it or
Yeah.
rationalize it, or their own makeup
Yeah.
supports the creation of that story in order to
Mhm.
rationalize their behavior.
Yeah.
It's just they don't necessarily see it in the same way. But also from an online communication point of view, I don't have to see the whites of your eyes.
Mm.
So it's this very much this kind of detachment where I can dehumanize you in a lot of
Yeah.
different ways. You are just a disembodied social media profile or a disembodied text message in which I can engage with you and I can rationalize the behavior in which I'm exploiting you.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
That
it's,
that yeah, that
yeah,
rationalization, and again, this is what I'm always fascinated by. It is those links between um domestic abuse and the financial abuse is that rationalization from a perpetrator that they do not think that they're doing anything wrong. They have rationalized it to themselves, and like you say, there's so many other factors that come in to it. Maybe it's learned behavior from their own childhood. Maybe it's the fact that like you say, part of their personalities. Anyway, there's so many things that
there's
come
so many
into
factors
it.
to it.
So
It's
many, so
incredibly
many.
complex.
It's
Yeah.
crazy, and like you say, with the fact that in terms of online scams and fraud, is they don't have to see that person. When it is in person, I'm not sure a perpetrator actually would care any more or less. I think it's more of an incentive to keep that power and control going when it's a relationship, and and there is a lot of ties, maybe children, etc. But yeah, in essence, that thread runs through all of it, and that's what's so terrifying to me. And another aspect is now where people go for support, because again, another complexity is so often people don't know that they even need support. So sometimes if I'm delivering an online session and I'm talking about post-separation abuse, which is my particular specialty, but at the end, when I sum up, I'll say, and obviously, if you yourself, if anything's resonated with you, or if there's somebody and you think that this kind of, it's ringing too many alarm bells, here's a list of, my resources page of where you can go for support. And again, there will be people who'll say, I had somebody recently who said, I haven't thought about this since my childhood, and I never saw it as domestic abuse. And when we had the conversation, it was that sort of epiphany moment for her, and it was really powerful. She just sort of attended this session as a bit of a, yeah, we'll sit down, find out a bit more about post-separation abuse. But when I kind of delved a bit deeper, and I never go too far, because let's be honest, in an hour, how much can you actually say?
Yeah, again, in that sort of scenario, you also can't necessarily always provide that safe space for when somebody is in that situation as well. It's like,
Exactly.
what do
Yeah.
I do with this now?
And they don't even know they're disclosing, and you sort of,
Yeah,
right, okay, so let's have a check-in at the end, sort of, and that's where I think it's really powerful when we're doing things like this, when we're talking about things in a way that people can relate and think, well, I never thought of it as abuse. It was just that person's behavior. It's just the way they were.
it's
That's
again that
normal.
rationalization, isn't it?
Exactly. And we come back to that time and time again. And that for me is where the difficulties lie, when there are so many people who will look at others and say, oh, it's never happened to me. You can walk in a room and you can say, I did an episode a while ago with a chap called Richard Port, and he's an MBE's solicitor, brilliant guy around family courts and obviously family affairs. And he was saying he goes in a room, and when people ask him what he does, and he says, "Oh, I'm specialising in domestic abuse," like, "Oh, okay," kind of walk off, because people don't want to know. They hear these words of scams, fraud, domestic. They hear all these things, coercive control, and think, "Well, it's nothing to do with me. It doesn't affect me." And I think until we change that narrative and say, "Well, actually, think about the people in your life. Think about your own life. And maybe you'll find, we're not saying find something wrong, but maybe just take a step back and really try and think if this is something that potentially does affect you, because more than likely it'll affect either yourself or somebody you know.
And that's the thing, is that this comes back to the empathy, really, is that most of the language that we tend to use in education, most of the language we use in trying to refer to it as well, is it often creates this kind of overconfidence bias in a lot of people. Is that I've never been in that situation, therefore, or again, you may have rationalized it from parents, from family members, from friends. It's just the way they are, or the amount of stories we've told ourselves in the past that will justify that behavior. But it's interesting to me because the empathy, and that's why the two fields are quite, there's a kind of a murky line between the two, because very often people don't have empathy for those of people who are in that position.
Yeah.
There is this real inflated ownership over the victim who puts themselves in that situation. Like, well, no, no. There is still a criminal element or a person who has created this environment or seeks to fortify that environment to keep them in that situation. Now, like for instance, for me, is it like very drastically different situation. But this what kind of started me on this. So I used to be a carer, and looked after my mum, who was disabled from the neck down with MS for since she was diagnosed since I was about 4 through to when she passed away when I was just about 28. And it's interesting to me because very often is that because of mum's health conditions, because of the situation, you are very, very good at creating yourself a narrative around the status quo, and the situation in relation to, okay, well, I'm looking after mum, but because of mum's both hypochondria, her condition, her fear in a lot of these sort of situations around her health condition, she kind of kept me in a box for most of my life, if you will. And she kept me in that kind of situation in so much so that very often I didn't really have a relationship with my father until after she passed. It was very, very difficult to have relationships at all because
Yeah.
again, only so much of your emotional real estate is taken up in some fashion. And again, it's very difficult to allocate emotional real estate when it's taken up by somewhere else as
Yeah.
well. And not to say that my mum was abusive, but because of her fear and because of her health condition, because of the way she acted, because of the way her personality was, is that very often it created what was essentially a 24-year-old to a 24-year-old block or box that I was kind of kept in. So when she passed, it felt like I come out of a cult. Like the world completely changed. It was very, very different in relation to I'd lost most of my family as was at that point. So I was like very much on my own. But it was very much this case of going, okay, well, where do I go from here?
Yeah.
And still, it's very much the case of going through therapy, going through those processes to explore it, to say, well, actually, Paul, you could have left. I will no, that was never an option. That was never an
That
option to
wasn't
me.
an option, no.
Like that didn't even factor into my mind. I'd have probably considered something much more drastic before even considering
Yeah.
leaving in that situation before that happens. And and I think this is the case, is that so much so as people say, well, why didn't you just do something about it? Why didn't you reach out to your dad, or why didn't you reach out or seek help in these different guises, etc. But it's like, because I was very good at telling myself a story that I didn't need to,
Need it, yeah.
and that it was the situation I was in, that it was my mum, that's the way she was. And yeah, it's probably taken me nigh on, God, what, 8, 9 years to figure out that narrative as well, and where it was not just kind of not just wrong, but it's also on the basis of going how it has affected me. So it's looking at that and looking at that behavior, and and let's be honest, probably reason why I do what I do in relation to
Yeah.
understanding why humans do that and why humans are much more vulnerable to that coercion and manipulation in various guises in all its forms. And yes, do I concentrate on the online side where essentially your emotional projection is so much more fortified? A relationship online can sometimes be more powerful than a relationship in person.
Yes.
And sometimes that's very, very difficult for people to understand. But actually, without any actual feedback for their personality differences, their flaws, their aspects, in very often when I say this, I say, well, have you ever read a book that's been turned into a film? And did you agree with a casting choice for the main character in that book? Well, of course you didn't. Um, because actually the author can be the most beautiful writer in the world, but very often you create the framework around the character based on your own beliefs, who you are, your vulnerability, everything that makes you you at this moment. And that's no different to online communication. But I would also extend that is that with relationships, depending on the level of trauma, the level of impact as well, is that's exactly what we do with other people in real life as well. Your partner, your friend is not who they are, it's who you believe they
Believe them to
are.
be. Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. That needs to go on a t-shirt. That does. Your partner isn't who they are, who you
Well,
believe they
that's
are.
the thing, is it
Yeah.
again, you can look past flaws. Even in the best of relationships, your partner is not who you believe they are.
Yeah.
There is so much complexity to that. But again, as I said, is that you create the picture based on your feelings towards them,
Yeah.
based on your need for being with them, the relationship you have with them, and all those different factors and all the very muddy pile that goes into that.
Yeah.
But
And
that's
there's
the
a
thing,
lot.
is it's the part your partner is who you believe they are.
Yeah.
And when somebody comes in, so when we talk about the industry calls it the spell. So when somebody is very often under that influence of a scam artist or a fraudster or a criminal, and is manipulating them, is that no matter how much I can tell you, they no, won't necessarily believe it, because again, is that the narrative in which I've created of the love, the investment opportunity, the
Yeah.
whatever the opportunity I have, very often banks, law enforcement, third sector is there to intervene at the stage where actually, have you tried to tell a person that they're in a relationship they shouldn't be in? And how difficult is that to do? Just,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another factor there, in terms of the family and friend element. And I think again, we focus so much in the roles that we do on the victims, the survivors, those who are in those situations. But actually, peripherally, there are so many family and friends who are, I'm not necessarily saying distress is the word really, because
yeah,
depending on the situation, they are distressed, they are concerned, they are worried, but they're scared of potentially losing that family member by saying, have you thought for a second that maybe this person isn't for you?
yeah.
Because the chances are that person will either say, because they're probably so isolated by this point anyway, in terms of access to their family and friends, to finances, to work, to all these things.
Mhm.
And obviously, I will always say every situation is unique. There's very similar
Very much so.
threads that run through, but every situation is unique. And then, with those family and friends, you can very much become even more isolated because you're pushing people away, because you're, like you say, you want to believe in this person. You've invested time, you've invested money, you've invested emotions, you've invested years, you've invested yourself. And I did an episode again recently with a psychotherapist called Sari Taylor, and we talked about the element of friendship and what would she do in that situation. And I actually joked with her and said, what I love is like she'd already been on a course, because she was saying, I would just be there to listen,
Yeah.
kind of that quiet in the background, waiting in the wings if they needed me, because trying to force somebody out of their reality, if you like, in inverted commas, it is possibly one of the most dangerous things you can do,
Yeah.
not only for yourself as a family and friend, but also for the victim and survivor, because you could be pushing them even deeper into that situation.
Because if you think if you think of your body and your mind as a kind of a system, is it that narrative that you create, the belief you have in your partner, the belief you have in the person you're engaging with, etc., whether that be online or offline. Now, in any sort of situation, is that very often is that you can have a more, and I say this in inverted commas, you can have a kind of a comfortable situation where your narrative supports and is at kind of equilibrium. So that could be in that incredibly difficult environment and context. That could be in manipulation because there is a need being met. Your parts are, again, are influencing your behavior, etc., in order to maintain that system in some way because of that need that needs to be met. Now, the thing is with that is that very often is that when when we say comfortable, is that that comfortable can be extreme levels of stress, extreme levels of pressure, extreme levels of abuse, because again, is that that's what your part or your body or your mind is conditioned to and it's used to. So in any, like again, and I'm you are by every stretch of the imagination the expert on this bit, but especially post abuse in those situations, is that you're still, like, again, as soon as you're triggered back into it, it's very, very difficult for you to find an environment or a comfortable state that is anything other than extreme high levels of stress environment, which why very often we find partners that are similar in, unless we've looked at the burden that put us in the situation in the first place. So it's very difficult because people from the outside can see that stress, that manipulation, the abuse. They can see it in the cold light of emotionless day, and very often, but as soon as you prick that bubble, what is that person going to retreat to?
Absolutely. They are 100%. And this is why, again, with the risk factor element when it comes to victims. So, for example, obviously, emergency services go out to an incident, and it obviously could be something very, very serious. And for example, it's the police, and you've got two people in this very highly volatile situation, and the police are having to get involved. But when they start assessing the risk factors and try to help the victim, in some cases, obviously the risk factor for them isn't the same as somebody else, because in the victim's head, well, this is my normal. This is my norm. So when we sort of start talking about domestic homicide, how does it go from this to this? It's because for those victims, their level of normal isn't other people's level of normal. And that's exactly it. That's the difficulty. And then to keep that momentum going, because that's what that's what you understand, that's what your adrenaline, all these chemicals running through your body all the time are there, and you become so used to it because that's what you're used to, that fear in the pit of your stomach. When a door slams, we talk about trauma informed, when somebody, I don't know, a car horn goes and somebody jumps out of their skin, it's, and a friend might laugh going, oh my God, what's wrong with you? But in terms of post-separation abuse, for that person, it could have been that the perpetrator's constantly honking up, get in their car, do this, do that. And that for them is taking them back to those moments. And it is very difficult to assess those risk factors because, and I do, in terms of services, it is very difficult because how do they assess that when for that person, that is their normal?
And that's the thing, is it that, and this is what triggered a lot of my research in relation to, so when I was a carer as well, is that I was used to and conditioned to quite copious amounts of consistent stress. Like it's and to be fair, even what my mum passed in 2015, and probably 9 years on, I'd still say that I find it very difficult not to exist in a certain kind of, I say again, that normal state of quite elevated high levels of stress. Again, things like burnout and all these sorts of things. And I would push myself to the nth degree, probably find it sometimes very difficult to relax in various guises because it's been, although a lot better than I was, very different. It's very, very hard to get back to that normal or to find the new normal. And it's interesting because this what kind of went down the kind of rabbit hole in relation to the subjectivity of communication. Now, bear with me. so is that
I love bearing with you, Paul, because you always take me on a journey. Go.
It's like, for instance, when I would get a phone call from her, like I'd be at work or somewhere else, etc. I'd get a phone call, and very often it was the case. It would spike this whole level of adrenaline and fear and anxiety in the center of my chest, and it would take me over. Sometimes I'd have that kind of burning feeling over my head around stress in relation to, and it was just a phone call, and she'd go, "Can you pick up some milk on the way home?" And it's like, yeah, fine, of course, I'll sort that. Yeah. But that's the thing, is very often it's the case where when it comes down to things like text messages, emails, phone calls, messages, is that very often when I present on the kind of psychology of fraud and online crime, I said, look, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner? Now, obviously, in our context that we're talking about, that's a very different kettle of fish. But in any other situation, everybody has taken a text message the wrong way from a partner,
100%.
whether you've whether you've had an argument that morning or something like that. But it's because it's the emotional context and your well-being at that very moment and the relationship context of that text message. It's not just that text message in like, asking you, what do you want for dinner tonight? No. You may take that the wrong way because you had an argument when you left the house.
Everything around it
it is the emotional context to it.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to fraud and scams and manipulation, is that I don't have any intuition in order to confirm what I'm reading. All I have is my emotional projection, the emotional context in which I'm living in at that very moment, the story in which I'm telling myself, and I will read it in the way I want to read it.
Yeah.
And that goes for social media posts, that goes for emails, it goes for text messages, it goes for, because what we are reliant on so much more now is subjective communication. We read things in the way you want to read it. Now, this is where you get into the realms of disinformation, fake news, radicalization, online grooming, coercive control, manipulation, fraud and scams. For me, my research ties them all into one because it's the subjectivity of technology. We are, as a human race, we are so much more emotionally subjective because of technology in various guises. So when you have that text message, is that communication, and a lot of the work that I and research have looked at, is that it becomes a hyper personal. It is, if I talk to you, if I go on a date with you, if I engage with you, if I have a relationship with you, both romantic or otherwise, I get a lot of feedback intuitive feedback to confirm or deny my beliefs around you. I still will create a belief around you, but generally speaking, I have a lot of things that come from you intuitively, both from body language and all these sorts of things. Online, I don't.
Yeah.
And depending on the level of narrative in which I'm telling myself, the more and more I will want to believe something about you in various guises. So it's very much that case of saying that text message, I have the power to edit. I have the power to change that text message. I have the power to read your message over and over again. I can read it and it's like, what does this person mean by it? Now, the problem is with this is that if you're in a highly abusive relationship or a difficult coercive control relationship or anything like that, you probably have that anxiety in the center of your chest going, okay, that this is sending a text is basically like navigating a landmine or a minefield. Is that because you're going, I'm trying to minimize and survive here.
Yeah.
But even that also works for positive aspects. Online dating, online communication, the romance I'm fledgling online that could potentially be ultimately a romance scam, but actually I want them to love me. I want them to like me. I have some sort of prerequisite in which I want as a result of this communication. So very often that emotional projection is even more powerful. So very often, because of that subjectivity, we project so much more and it becomes more hyper personal because there's no feedback to tell us any different.
Yeah. And like you say, you're not seeing the whites of someone's eyes. You're not you're not seeing the body language. You've not got any of that. And like you say, it's really clever. It's like that author aspect again, isn't it? If you're very good at writing, if you're very good at storytelling, then you are going to be able to create a masterpiece. And that is scary. It really is scary. And that I have to say, before I even go any further, for you sharing everything you've shared, because obviously I always find it really, and it gets overused all the time now, but the word empowering, to me, I find it really empowering when people who are experts, people who do what they do day in, day out, and why I started this podcast in the first place was to get professionals involved and say, look, this is what it's about. These are people. But at the end of the day, we are all still people. We're all still human beings, and we all have experiences. And very often the best of the best are the ones who've experienced something and then choose that path to say, actually, I'm going to use what I've experienced and learned, and I'm going to do this as best I can to help other people. And I think that's and it's not easy, because, you know, you're treading that line, aren't you, between your own personal and your professional. I think you do it brilliantly, and I think you do bring a lot into what you do, but that had to be said. Sorry.
I appreciate that, Lucy. But it's interesting, is it, because again, it can also have the opposite effect, and it has for me in many cases had the opposite effect, is that I've believed so strongly in what I'm trying to do. Sometimes I feel like I'm pushing a wet noodle up a hill, but it's very much on the case of going, like, well, actually, I have burnt myself out in the past, etc., trying to get things across the line, or understanding what needs to be done in relation to combating this sort of thing, and the language that needs to be changed. And very often you are combating, and the same with you, I think, Lucy, in various guises, is you are battling a societal bias, that has been around for an exceedingly long time.
Yeah.
And that's the real difficulty, is that we are, it's not, it's in everybody's language, it's in everybody's perspectives. And the thing is, I do a lot of work around risk as well, is that why would I be motivated to take on board the education in order to believe it? So online dating, for instance. Well, I didn't know the education existed before I was a victim of that romance scam. Well, yes, but you picked up Hinge or Tinder or that platform for very different reasons.
Yeah.
You didn't, if you started that journey believing that you would be ultimately manipulated, I don't think you'd pick it up. Like, I probably would avoid it. But the thing is it very often it's the case is that a lot of these issues are not emotional problems until they are.
Yeah.
Is that these become very abstract risks. They're very difficult for you to empathize with. It's
Yeah.
very difficult for you to create an image in relation to it. So if I say terrorism, for instance, everybody has an image in their head that represents the problem to them. It's very emotional. It's very visceral. You've seen it on the TV, etc.
Yeah.
But if I say fraud, is that, well, actually, most people don't have an image that represents the problem. So
Yeah.
very often it's the case of going, well, I have no emotional hook for me to be motivated to even bother taking board the education.
Yes, yeah, it has no relevance to me, you know.
No.
It's not something, and that's why it's brilliant that more and more is coming out in the
Yes.
news, in the papers, and I always have a bit of a love-hate relationship with, because I'm not the best at social media, and I probably should be.
I'm terrible.
But I find it really difficult. Yeah, and I made myself a promise as I was getting older to not get involved in what's going gossip online and all this and all, you know, so much news. There's too much out there now for me. But at the same time, what we should be focusing on are the things that are important
Yes.
to be getting out there, the messages to get out there, i.e. scams and fraud. And I've noticed more and more recently on the news, you know, programs, won't say what channels, but anyway, various channels.
Things have changed. Things are changing
Yeah,
in a lot of
and
ways.
it is, you're right, it has been such a long time coming, and changing that narrative, changing that stigma around these conversations and these topics. And you're right, you know, I said in an episode recently about when people say, well, you fell for that person, you know, these classic sort of terms that I really wish could just be pinned forever.
Yeah.
And I said to this person, we were talking about it, and I said, you know, it's as if people think that an individual, male, female, whoever they are, in terms of a romantic relationship, walk into that situation and, you know what, this is going to be abusive. I 100% know that this person,
Sign me up.
Yeah, down the line, I know that I'm going to be going through post-separation abuse for 20 years. Wow, that's not a problem. Of course, that's not the case. You go into those situations, like you say, and then it evolves. And also, we all change over time. I'm very different. Somebody said something recently, which was a real compliment from a friend of mine's mum, who had said, I can't believe what Lucy's doing now, because it's not her. You know, when I was younger, I wouldn't have, if you'd have said to me, by the time you're nearly 46, you'll be sitting there doing an episode of a podcast, you'd be working for yourself, consulting, etc. I'd have said, absolutely not. I preferred to blend in. I didn't like being the one that would stand out in the crowd. But when you become so passionate about something, then, you know, you do
It does
change,
make a difference.
perspective changes, and you learn that actually stepping outside that comfort zone, helping other people, yeah, absolutely, sign me up for that. 100% I'll do that. But it isn't easy. And I think, again, you know, with the romance fraud, with domestic abuse, people do change and people do evolve. And I think that in the situations where somebody starts to realize that, you know, things aren't quite right, that's when now it's so important for people to know, well, there is help, you know, and there is no shame in typing that email, sending an inquiry, going on, you know, picking the phone up, whatever it is. And even just asking the question, because I've had people ask me before, I'm not really sure if what I'm experiencing is abuse. There is absolutely no shame in asking that question, because you will get an honest answer and you will be pointed in the direction of whatever it is you need. Because, and again, with support, it's different for everybody. Some people prefer group facilitation, which some people prefer one-to-one. And some people might try it and say, that's not for me, thank you very much. It's all about timing. It might be that they have to come back to it. But now more than ever, there is so many elements of support out there, aren't there?
That's I think that's a really important aspect, because like you said, is that there's two parts of that. Is that, first of all, it's very difficult for anybody to cross the Rubicon and either to say, oh, what I've actually kind of had in that environment, in that context, what I've experienced is actually abuse.
Yeah.
It is so difficult to kind of label that as it, because very often you're like, well, other people have had it worse, or well, okay, well, my situation wasn't physical. I've heard this so many different times, etc. Or that online coercion, well, it wasn't emotional or physical. Well, actually, it was emotional and it was economic, for instance,
and
etc.
it may affect you physically, as in terms of your health, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the case, is that when people refer to it, and this is the same thing in our education as well, and very often when we talk about fraud and scams, but also things like domestic abuse as well, is that the thing is, people expect people to have that moment to stop, to reflect, to think about what's happening at this very moment in relation to it. Now, what we always forget is the emotional context of any of these situations, that very often they are highly charged. A criminal will want to create, out of all the things I want to create to try and manipulate you or socially engineer you, for instance, the first and foremost one is emotion. Because for instance, fraud and online crime, what's the difference between fraud and marketing?
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. Like the only difference between fraud and marketing is the intention of the user. Is that very often I want to get you to direct link, or I want you to engage with me. I want you to have a conversation with me. I want you to buy a product, in inverted commas, but also I want to have a relationship with you, or that ongoing relationship with you, whether that be, again, perceived as romantic or otherwise. But the fact is that people, it's called manipulation for a reason. You don't know you're being manipulated. If you knew you were being manipulated, it wouldn't be called manipulation. Like, and this is like, again, like language like, oh, it's too good to be true, then it is. I'm like, well, is there a magical spreadsheet somewhere that tells me what is too good?
What is too
like
that we don't know about?
like, if there is one, then fantastic. But that's the thing, is that, again, is that like, oh, your relationship is too good to be true. Like, what do you mean too good to be true? Am I not worthy of having a relationship that is exciting, that is passionate, that I believe in, that I love, and all these sorts of things, because I am in love with the person that I believe I am with?
Yeah, I believe I'm with. Yeah, it is. And this is where, this is what I love about episodes like this, is it brings in so much about that psychology. And I think sometimes, and I've done courses myself where I've been sitting there at the end of it and I'm kind of like, okay, there's a lot of science in there. Your head's spinning by the end of it. You're kind of going, right. For me, it has to be in this way, this kind of bite size where you can take it away, understand it. And I think when it is something as complex as fraud and scams, as coercive control, manipulation, all these elements, I think it has to be done in a way that we're not frightening people. And hopefully this is what that does, because it is that conversation. It is that saying, it's okay to talk about it. I know we have this thing, I think it's mental health awareness, isn't it, around it's okay to not be okay. Well, it's also okay to not have to worry about talking about domestic abuse or scams and fraud, and and not feel that shame and not feel that guilt that, you know, oh, they saw me come in, you know, saw me coming a mile off. Well, actually, as you say, it's down to belief, it's down to each individual. And when I say sometimes that domestic abuse can happen to anybody, people will look at me as if I'm bonkers. Like, well, I wouldn't let it happen to me. And straight away I was like, how do you know it hasn't already? Because your normal might be normal to you, but how do you know that your normal is not? And what is normal?
Mhm.
What is everybody's normal? What somebody, like you say, what one person is willing to live with day to day is not necessarily what somebody else is willing to live with day to day. And a lot of the time, it's not about whether you're willing or not. It's about, again, it's about that subject.
The prerequisite for that vulnerability is that you're human and breathing.
Yeah.
That's what I've always said in relation to any sort of manipulation. There is a flavor of manipulation for everyone. Like it's not discriminate. It again is that like that's very much the case where there is that flavor of manipulation, that fraud, that scam, that exploitation, that relationship at the time that you really could have done without it because you didn't see it coming. And it's like, well, no, of course you didn't see it coming because you're allowed to be a human being in those moments. You're allowed to be vulnerable. You're allowed to be those situations as well. And the fact that somebody took advantage and manipulated you in that process, again, it's a, that's the problem with a lot of the language is that even in those situations where somebody has actively taken advantage of that situation or that vulnerability, it's still very often where that societal bias is that, well, the victim should have seen it coming, or they fell for it, they were duped, or they were tricked, or they were manipulated, or why did they not get out of a situation once they realized, etc. Like because it wasn't their normal.
Exactly. And that's the thing I think is going to be I'm normally quite I wouldn't say, I love this a Desmond Tutu quote is I'm not an optimist, but I'm a prisoner of hope. And in most of the things I put on LinkedIn is
I like
hashtag
that.
hope. Anything I write. And I think for me, you know, I used to tell myself I was an optimist. Now I think, no, I'm just a prisoner of that hope that things will get
Yeah.
better. And I do hope that's the case, because that's the fear for me is how do we change that perspective? How do we, you know, we can talk about it, but how do we get people to really understand that it isn't by choice that you are in the situation you're in? It is about a million other factors, as we've said, that come into it. And I know education is definitely, you know, part of it. I'm really passionate in terms of children and young people being educated more in an age
100%.
appropriate way around domestic abuse. And again, you know, we do have these talks now around healthy relationships within schools. But for me, it needs to go further. It needs to be in primary school, not just secondary. You know, it's those kind of elements where, because at that point in time, when we talk about childhood and learned behavior and what we see when we grow up, I remember going to my daughter's final play in primary, and my brain being the way it is, and because I look through a certain lens in terms of domestic abuse, I'm looking at 32 children on stage thinking, I wonder how many are going to be victims and I wonder how many are going to be perpetrators. And I'm sure nobody else, I'm not saying they weren't, but I don't think anybody else in that hall that day was probably thinking that.
Possibly not, but it's true.
Possibly not. But
Because,
but that's the way
yeah.
my brain works. And I think, and what is it we need to do to be able to, you know, stop that generational, and because we are further on than we were before. You know, years ago we never talked about abuse of older people. It was just, that's my marriage. That's the way it was in the 40s, 50s when we got married. It was this, he did this, I did that, that was that. Now more and more people, and I don't want to quote statistics because I never do. I always say they're never a true reflection of what actually is going on in society. It's just a snapshot of what is there. But in terms of abuse of older people, more and more people are coming forward to talk about it, which is fantastic in the fact that they're admitting that what they've experienced for the majority of their lives is not right, you know, and they shouldn't have to feel that way.
But we're never taught what a healthy relationship is.
No.
And that's very often the case of going, and yeah, this goes sends everywhere really, is that you are very often a product of your parents' choices, and your parents, you know, that it becomes the blueprint and the model for your relationships. Your relationships with your parent becomes a blueprint, whether that be codependency, whether that be abuse, whether that be a number of different things. It becomes the blueprint for how you see love and you see that relationship. Now, the problem is that now, like from the education point of view and a school education point of view, is it that you end up having a generational domino effect where unless at some point, and I think a lot of things are changing. I think, well, if I could afford therapy for the entire UK population, that'd be great, but I don't think that's going to be cost effective. But very often it is the case of going, we don't teach what a healthy relationship is because that would be a complete minefield in
Yeah,
various guises. I think that should be part of well-being education within schools
yeah,
is in relation to how do you have a healthy relationship? How do you also navigate because your relationships are much more technology based now.
yes,
Our relationships have not changed. No, we haven't created technology in order to meet the way humans have relationships. Instead, we have changed the way we have relationships to meet how technology is created.
yeah,
And very often, when it comes to Instagram and social media and text messages and that world which is constant conflict in various guises, is that no wonder we have a mental health issue in relation to
yeah,
that. But that's the thing is that we're not taught how to have that healthy relationship. And again, from a kid's point of view, is that you're starting to have those first forays into relationships in various guises. And what you're immediately going to do is you're going to project the blueprint that you have at your disposal.
yeah. And what a
Now,
blueprint that is now looking at technology, dear God.
yeah,
That's the fear to me when I've got an
and
11-year-old daughter, you know.
not fun. But
No.
it's also the fact that it's from a relationship point of view as well, is that because of that subjectivity, it is very, very difficult for you to like even with like in the past, my therapist has said to me sometimes in some cases that you can't unring the bell. Like
Yeah,
you saw on the stage with all those children, you can't unring the bell. You
yeah,
can't not see it in various guises. And very often when I'm talking to somebody online or I'm dating or engaging with somebody or talking to a relationship or friendship or whichever, that subjectivity is very crucial. And even if you're completely aware of it, it's still very difficult to navigate.
yeah,
And especially for young people as well, is that when you're in that first forays of those relationships, how do you are you supposed to know what is right and
absolutely.
what
Yeah,
is again what is acceptable behavior?
yes.
Because
And this is, do you know what? And I think sometimes what would, for me personally, what I think would be incredible is if a lot of the tools that are used for intervention work with children and young people were actually used within school. So I did a post on LinkedIn the other day, and it was actually I can see my philosophical side coming out from uni, and it was my washing basket, and it's got light and dark because obviously I'm very OCD, and you know I like it separated out already. I don't want to have to do all that with children. Um, and I made this kind of correlation between like the light and dark aspects, and around what we are in control of and what we aren't in control of. And in the end, it worked out. I knew where I was going. I had a thread, and I got there in the end. Bit Ronnie Corbett style, going around the houses, but I eventually got there. And then the point of it was about this circle of control model that is used
Yes.
with children, and especially children who are being supported due to domestic abuse, either themselves or they've lived within a household there where there's been domestic abuse. And it's a really, really powerful model, and it talks about what is within our control and what isn't. And if that was something that was rolled out to me anyway,
Oh
I'm
God.
no teacher, but if that was rolled out,
I still need to learn that one.
and it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's something, and I refer back to it quite a lot. You know, when we talk about, okay, our own feelings, that's within our control. How other people treat us, that's, how we, all these aspects of things in life which we do and don't have control over. And once we can separate those out from a young age,
Yes.
then we're going to have children who are a lot more emotionally intelligent to be able
Mhm.
to say that's acceptable, that's not acceptable. But as I
Whether
say,
you're in
I'm
a
no teacher.
relationship, whether you're at work, whether you're any situation, being able to understand what you can and cannot control, and again, is that accountability? Like again, I'll talk about this accountability. As a carer for most of my life, I find it very difficult to allow other people to have accountability over their own actions and their feelings. Funny enough. So very often I'm quite sometimes and I'm again better at it than they used to be. But very often it's very difficult in relationships and things like that, and also in situations at work, etc. Very often I will be quite hyper vigilant in relation to what I can and cannot control, etc. I'm like, no, hold on a second, that's their responsibility. Like,
Yeah.
that's so I'm going to set that boundary. But
Yeah.
again, it's that their responsibility. It's I don't have I shouldn't have to manage everything about this situation in order to navigate this sort of scenario, whether it be a professional or a personal sort of thing.
Yeah.
So very often it's very different. But then when again looking back on it, I'm like, oh, of course that's what I do because that's what my more or less my entire first 28 years of my life
My
was.
life was all about, yeah.
Because for all the will in the world, my mum didn't always take particularly a great deal of accountability over, well, anything. But that's the thing, is that very often it's the case of that learned behavior. What that like real healthy relationship looks like is that the amount of times that I've had moments in therapy, in personal life, etc., that all of a sudden it's gone, oh, I didn't have to do that, or I don't have to accept that behavior. I don't have to rationalize that their behavior, etc. It's just setting those boundaries and understanding those differences.
Yeah, and that's true, and that's, to me, is part of that element of growing. And as we develop and as we get older, we do find, hopefully, many of us do find those aspects of ourselves where we can say, and again, that accountability. I love that, because these are the things, like you say, that have formed us from when we were younger. Before I worked for a domestic abuse charity, I used to work for another charity, and they did a profiling of everybody. And I just remember thinking, oh God, no, what's mine going to be? And it was, very organized, very this, very that, all very positive in a lot of ways. But then you look at the kind of negative list, and the top of the negative list was doesn't have boundaries, doesn't know when to say no, will take on anything that's thrown at her. And that has stayed with me, because I thought, I grew up as one of 6. So you all had to muck in. It's not like kids now where they get to sit there and dinner's delivered and everything else is done for them. You had your chores, you had your jobs, you had your
This is your
responsibilities.
job.
Yeah, and you got on with it. And
So
won't
many
I?
cases, I think, as well, Lucy, on top of that, sorry to
Yeah,
interject, but especially from that accountability, I think as well, is that in a domestic abuse situation, is that so often when I've seen cases, both from a law enforcement point of view, from talking to you, from a number of different things, is that also they enforce that accountability on you.
yeah,
Is that
yeah,
their behavior, well, how could you not possibly think about me in this situation? How could you not, again, are you not wanting to do you not love me enough to do this action or to do this bit aspect as well? So very often it's that, okay, well, I'm going to force you to have accountability over me and my emotions because this is who I am and this is how I'm going to respond. Therefore, you're in charge here. You're in charge of this responsibility, etc., and you're in charge of my emotional well-being.
yeah.
So I can imagine that aspect is that you end up having similar behaviors created from very different scenarios
Yeah.
in relation to, okay, well, I'm really hyper vigilant on how you are going to take accountability, or I'm in charge of your emotions, or I'm in charge of what you're doing with your life. So yeah, I can imagine that's quite.
And again, in thinking in terms of being one of 6, it's just making me think now about the different dynamics, because just because you're one of 6 and you share, genetics, doesn't mean that you are the same people. We were all very diverse in terms of personalities. And when I came, so I'm an overthinker, and I was thinking a lot about this, why I didn't have boundaries and why I didn't do this and why I would never say no. And I can remember one of the jobs me and one of my sisters had was dusting the sitting room. So one would get the dusting, one would get the hoovering. And I think on this occasion I was hoovering. So I'm doing it. And don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with children having things and responsibilities within the household. I think it's a great idea. And actually it teaches them respect for themselves, respect for the home. There's so many good aspects about it. And you
It
feel
certainly avoids an
yourself.
element of entitlement as well.
Yeah, exactly. And in this day and age, that to me is so important.
Oh,
If my daughter now says, can I do some chores?
that's a different podcast.
Yeah, we'll go on a whole other one for that. Yeah, we'll be there all day.
Yeah.
And I remember my sister had the duster in her hand and the spray. And she walked in the room, she just sprayed and walked out. And I just remember my mum coming afterwards going, well done. That's smart. Yes, yes, I can tell it's been dusted. She hasn't put a duster over anything. She was very savvy. She's a very, very clever girl. But and
That
still
smells like pledge in here. Done.
Yeah, stood there with a Hoover kind of going, what am I doing here? But I couldn't, my own guilt and fear, you know, I had to do the job. I had to Hoover and get it done. But then I did learn things from her after that. And I thought, oh, that's a neat trick. Just spray it in the air. I'm not sure what that says about her psychology, but anyway,
I love
that's
that.
a whole other story.
Just resorted just turning the Hoover on for 15 minutes and just seeing watching TV. Yes, the Hoover's been on.
Yeah, I'm doing it. Yeah, I should have. I'm glad to say I didn't learn anything from that in terms of going that far myself, but I did start thinking, oh, right, that's how you have an easy life. I get it now. Okay, but my personality was I couldn't sleep at night not knowing that, you know.
Oh, I'm the same. Yeah, no. Like, oh, I can't possibly. I would just guilt like a conscious brick wall.
Yeah, waking up at 2 in the
No,
morning, going,
no.
oh my God,
No.
going downstairs and doing it. That's why I think as years went by, I was nicknamed by my siblings as Monica and Friends, because just the cleaning aspect and everything having to be you know, don't leave your shoes out in the hole, my eyes twitching, and you know, and I'm still like that now, and I can't break it, but well, I can if I want to, but I quite like being a neat freak. I'm not gonna lie. It doesn't bother me.
There is that balance. There is
It
that
is.
balance where you find
And it's
it.
recognizing it and it's knowing. And I genuinely can have days where I think to myself, there was a cobweb on the stairs the other day, and I thought, does it need to be done this second? No, it doesn't. Whereas in the past, I'd be there, Hoover out, going for it. And I thought, right in the middle of something, it's going to wait till later. Now, it was on my mind until I dealt with it, but I'm learning. And again, where you put your energies, where you put your, and especially when you are moving forward from abuse or any kind of awful situation in your life, it is learning, isn't it? That actually we don't have to do everything at once. We can have good days, we can have bad days, and we can say, actually, today I'm going to do the best I can. And if the best I can say is I got up, then that's okay.
And sometimes, very often, is it what behaviors do we replace it with?
Yeah.
So again, numbing behaviors that we look to. Now, again, that list is as long as you can possibly imagine, whether that be cleaning, frantically cleaning, etc. like that, because I don't want to feel what I would feel before. Now, that could be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be gaming, it can be any sort of behavior you can possibly think of, is that you will seek out to numb yourself to avoid those questions in various guises. Again, some people get into exercise in the same way very often, but we all do it. We all have our sin or our numbing behavior, even if it's the healthiest of numbing behaviors as we possibly can imagine. Is it very often is like, actually, this is something to avoid. But very often I can imagine that there is that balance. Is it going into the realms of what, oh, I'm trying to avoid what I should be feeling or what I should be unburdening or exploring in relation to picking up those stones to kind of get myself at more of an ease and find that new normal, or is it actually, no, it's just a healthy and it's a lovely way and a lovely experience? It's like, the problem is that line is very difficult to find. Like for me, things like exercise, gaming, a lot of aspects in the past has always been elements of numbing behavior. So when I'm really depressed or anxious, or a number of different factors, the kind of various roller coaster I've had since mum died 8 or 9 years ago, is that yes, I love doing those things, but sometimes it's got to the point where I'm like, yeah, why are you doing this that much? And again, but it's like, I know, actually, I just really enjoy it. But it's still going to be the thing that you end up numbing with.
Yeah, of course it is. And I think if that self-reflection and that asking yourself the question, you know, I think I've done that in terms of with the cleaning and all the rest. And for me, I had a conversation like this recently, and I said, for me, it's the end result. It's knowing that I can sit down and think, I've worked, and then I've done all my cleaning, I have a system to it and all the rest. And I think, but actually, it's because I'm very much with my children about cause and effect, you know, especially when they were younger. I did this, Mum, well, then there's a consequence to that, and there is an effect to what will happen. Nothing ever sinister or scary, just your phone will be taken away or whatever it would be, or, you know, all the things within school that were gone, say, well, that person said that, well, then that's going to happen. You know, so many complexities of life that you're trying to teach children. But I think for me, it was that the kind of the doing that cleaning, doing that work, gave me a result at the end of it that made me happy. And I thought, am I doing this because I have to do it? Am I doing this because I'm kind of conditioned to do it? Or am I doing this to avoid thinking about things? Or am I doing it for all those reasons? But actually the main one is, out of all that, I actually want to be able to sit down at the end of it and go, that feels good, you know, and that's nice. And watch whatever crap I want to watch on TV. Usually it's probably reruns of things from the 90s. I'm not going to lie. There's too much option. So many options now. I can't even keep up. It's too much.
Mine's Star Trek reruns, yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm all about the Frasier, Friend, any kind of, I'm very 90s American sitcom, just totally lose me in that, and I'm absolutely in my element, and bring me back to reality after about an hour and I'm okay, but that's my switch off. And again, you know, these are all the things that when you have experienced trauma, when you have experienced abuse, and you know you feel like you're being judged, it is okay to find those things that make you feel like you again in some ways, but also it's okay to develop it, to change it, and say, yeah, I'm allowed to have my little idiosyncrasies, but I'm also allowed to change that up and you know, leave a cobweb on the stairs if I feel like it.
And very often it's those sort of hobbies, those expressions of creativity, those anything that you're doing very often comes out in the woodwork afterwards when you realize you can actually just be accountable for yourself and explore who you are. So like, again, so many things post after mum passed as well, for no particularly negative reasons, but for on the basis of, well, as carers, you tend to get martyred in various guises. Is that every teacher, everybody around you kind of like, oh, you're such a good boy, you're such a good lad, you're such a good guy to look after your mum in various guises. And very often that narrative becomes a bit of a drug because, oh, well, actually my entire, and not to intellectualize this too much, my emotions, my feelings, but very often it's the case of going, well, actually, how is my self-worth tied to this? Well, my productivity, my ability to look after somebody else, and all these sorts of things. And that can be quite fortified after 20 something years. But it's also the case of after that is that you start to discover, and I think in any sort of manipulative, coercive, difficult relationship where you were judged, you were kind of, again, put in that emotional box, is that you find things that actually make you happy and it's not done for anybody else's purposes. I got back into painting and all these sorts of things as well, is that and hobbies that actually I would probably stop, like, okay, well, I won't do this because of what other people might think, or a situation where I don't have time, or all these sorts of things. But yeah, finding those things, and sometimes those can be the most therapeutic and cathartic processes because it is just for you.
It's just, and it is, and it's yours, and it's no, and that's a very difficult thing to find in life, isn't it? Things that are just yours and nobody else's.
And the fact that you allow yourself to have something that is just yours.
Oh, do you know what? I think that's a perfect way to have summed it up. And I've already picked my snippet out of something you've said before. I love it. It's just beautiful. And what I love about all this is we've covered so much and ended on a lovely note about it is okay to have those things for yourself that you can do. And and it is important to have these conversations, get them out there. But thank you so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure, Lucy. Absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Paul, and I'll see you very soon.